Northern Michigan in the mid 1980s did Halloween the way the lake did winter, slow at first, then all at once. By dusk, the air smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke, and the sky pressed low over the pines as if it wanted to listen. Parents checked porch lights twice. Kids stitched last minute costume seams with fishing line and tape. On every street, the same nervous excitement moved through families like a current. Houses handed out candy, teenagers rang doorbells just to watch people jump, and somewhere in the dark, an engine would start too early, too loud, like the night itself had an appointment. This year started like every other year. It wasn't just one missing kid. That was what made it unbearable. How the town collected absences year after year, always near the end of October, always around the same hour when trick-or-treating spilled past the point of normal bedtime. The first disappearances had been treated as isolated accidents at first. A child wandered too far, a prank went wrong, a runaway got scared and hid. Then the rumors hardened into something more specific, a pattern the town could taste even when it tried not to name it. Kids went missing after falling behind the group. Not always all at once, not always from the same neighborhood. Different friends, different routes, different costumes, and different parents standing on different porches with different voices calling their children back. But every report carried the same shape. A kid was there a minute, then there was a gap, one wrong turn, or one delayed step, and afterward, there was only absence. The connection didn't become obvious until the way it happened to Andy. The night it happened again. Andy Hale was 10, small enough that his costume gloves always looked a little too long. He didn't have the swagger of older kids. He had the stubborn focus of someone who wanted to belong. When he walked the sidewalk, he kept checking the street ahead and behind, tracking where everyone was without anyone asking him to. He wore a cheap plastic mask under his hood, just for fun at first, until the inside of it fogged his breath, and he pulled it off, tucking it into his jacket pocket like he might need it later. That night, he went out with a group of neighborhood kids led by older teens who liked to pretend they weren't responsible. They had rules anyway. Stay in sight. Don't go past the last lit house. If you drift, call out. Don't split up. The first houses were safe, in the way only familiar porches could be. Candy bowls sat under lamps that cast warm, honey-colored light. Adults joked with the kids, asked their names, admired their costumes with that forced enthusiasm people use to hide their own nerves. One woman painted spider webs on her windows and handed out caramel apples as if she was running a carnival rather than a front yard. The air was thick with sound, doorbells chiming, laughter popping, the rhythmic crinkle of wrappers beginning even before the night ended. Kids moved in a loose line, stepping from porch to porch in bursts, then regrouping at the next street corner, like their feet were on a metronome. Andy stayed with them. He tried to look brave when someone offered to tie a ribbon on his wrist. He tried not to watch the shadows between houses. But Halloween shadows always looked longer than they should. They passed a house where the porch light flickered in a steady rhythm. Not fast enough to be a malfunction, just slow enough to feel intentional. Another yard had decorations that looked undisturbed. No ripped plastic, no half-knocked-over skeleton, like everything had been staged and left waiting. A dog barked from a fenced yard, then went quiet the moment the group stepped past, the silence snapping into place as if the sound had been turned off by a switch. When they reached the block, everyone called the long way. Andy noticed the difference in the air first. It wasn't colder. Northern Michigan was always cold once the sun went down. It was thicker, as if the night had more weight on that street. The older kids started arguing about whether one more house counted as staying on the route. Voices got louder. Footsteps got quicker. Someone joked about how the next stop had too neat a yard. Someone else teased that maybe the owner didn't like noise. Andy followed anyway. He didn't want to be the kid who made the group look back. At one point, the group slowed at a corner because a car was parked half in the driveway, half on the street shoulder. The windows were dark. The engine had been off for a while, but the dark glass looked freshly cleaned, as if someone had been expecting company. The group moved around it, keeping their line. Andy kept his distance from the others, trying to read everyone's expressions for cues about where they were going next. Then a small thing happened. The kind of thing that doesn't look like the beginning of a nightmare from the outside. Someone bumped Andy's shoulder, not hard, just enough to shove him sideways toward the yard of a particular house. Andy reached out to steady himself on the fence post. The fence post had splinters that snagged his glove. "Come on," someone called. Andy looked up. Only a few seconds had passed, but the group was already moving. Teen voices receded down the sidewalk. Their Halloween laughter dulled into distance. Andy stepped after them, and then the yard shifted. Not physically in a way anyone could measure, but in that way your mind panics when your bearings go wrong. The porch light ahead seemed brighter than it should have been, and the path from one house to the next felt suddenly longer, like the street had stretched behind his back. He tried to call out. His voice caught in his throat. He didn't remember deciding to walk toward the porch. He only remembered the next sensation. A smell like vanilla, faint and sweet, carried on the cold air as if it had been held in someone's fist and released at just the right time. The porch light turned steady. A door opened. An old man stood there. He didn't smile. He didn't speak like a neighbor greeting trick-or-treaters. He held out a small treat, something cold and bright and wrapped as if it had already been portioned. Andy's mind latched onto it the way hungry kids latch onto candy, with relief, with permission, with the certainty that whatever happened next had to be part of the rules. Ice cream. A promise, offered like a reward for being obedient and quiet. Behind the old man's head, the night seemed to warp around his outline. His face was covered with a mask. The mask was made from something too ordinary to be terrifying, an old paper plate. The surface looked worn and reused, warped where it had been handled. Tiny eye holes had been poked into it as if someone wanted the right amount of visibility without the wrong amount of expression. There were no mouth holes at all, as if the mask was designed to prevent speech or smiling. Designed to keep the face from telling the truth. The old man stared straight at Andy with the stillness of someone waiting for a final step. Andy took the treat. That's when everything went wrong in a way that didn't feel like a clear abduction to a child. It felt like slipping underwater, like his body was moving while his mind wasn't sure it had agreed. The old man's hand didn't grab him hard. It just guided him, not through a struggle, but through closeness, through insistence, through the wrong certainty of being invited somewhere. Andy remembered turning his head once, just as if he could spot the rest of the group in the yard. He didn't see them, only the porch light and the neatness of the yard. And then blackness, damp air, the smell of old wood, and the sound of a basement that had been waiting long enough to become part of the house's heartbeat. What Andy could not explain. Andy woke on a floor that wasn't carpeted, cold enough that his bones complained. His hands were free, his wrists weren't tied, his mouth wasn't taped. There was no duct tape, no gag, no dramatic threat. Instead, the basement smelled like dust and damp stone, and something faintly sweet that made his stomach twist, like the memory of the ice cream had been preserved in the air. Around him were the others. Not strangers. Kids from town. Kids whose names people had said with lowered voices over the years. Kids whose birthdays had passed and whose empty chairs had become permanent. They were all there, safe, in the sense that they were alive and breathing, but shaken in the way children are when the world is too large to fit inside their understanding. Some were crying quietly without sound. Others stared at the walls like the cinder blocks might suddenly become a door. Andy tried to force his memory to behave. He tried to remember what had happened between the porch and the basement stairs. He couldn't. The edges of the moment were smeared. He could recall the treat. He could taste the sugar cold even after hours of dry panic. He could recall the mask, paper plate, tiny eye holes, no mouth holes, and the way the old man's face never changed even when Andy's fear escalated. But he couldn't reconstruct the steps. He couldn't explain why the rest of the neighborhood had been reachable only until suddenly it wasn't. No one else had a complete story either. They all remembered the promise. They all remembered the mask. They all remembered the feeling of being singled out right as they fell behind, like the night itself selected stragglers from the crowd and carried them away without raising alarm. The years that didn't connect. In town, Missing child cases were supposed to be handled one at a time. That's what adults wanted. A simple story with a single villain and an ending that came with a courtroom or at least a confession. But Halloween did not behave like a single incident. There had been reports the first year. A boy missing after drifting behind the group on Main Street. Another year, a girl who'd been seen near the edge of a lit neighborhood and then gone. Then several years where families stopped calling it one-off and started calling it the Halloween thing, as if naming the pattern made it less powerful. Those cases didn't match perfectly at first. Different roots, different ages, different friends, different costumes, different witnesses. Some families insisted the kid had just walked off. Others claimed they'd seen a man near a certain house, but nobody could describe him in a way that held up. Nobody had a name, nobody had a face. People searched for connections the way you search for a loose thread in a sweater, tugging until the whole garment pulls apart. And then, Andy came back. Not because he escaped, because the police found the basement. When detectives questioned Andy, his story added a detail the town hadn't gotten before. The mask was real in a way that wasn't rumor. Paper plate, tiny eye holes, no mouth holes, and the ice cream promise offered right as the group broke apart, right as someone fell behind. That was the missing piece that stitched every year together. It wasn't just kids going missing around Halloween. It was the same method, the same house, or at least the same kind of house, with the same weird neatness and the same porch light that didn't act like ordinary wiring. The same lure, sweet and warm and convincing. The same mask, designed to erase the face from memory. The police find a dead man. After the children were recovered, investigators did what they had to do even when their gut told them the case didn't belong to normal rules. They photographed everything. They measured distances. They checked permits. They pulled records on every occupant and every past resident of the suspicious property. The house stood where it had stood for years, an old place at the edge of town, with a yard that looked maintained too carefully for someone living alone. The street was quiet around it in a way that felt rehearsed. When police searched, they expected to find either a living suspect or at minimum evidence that a suspect could have returned recently. Instead, they found documentation that made the case turn inside out. The old man was dead years ago. How could he lure kids now? How could he keep repeating the pattern year after year without being caught? Investigators found signs that the house had been preserved in an unsettling way, maintained just enough that the environment still worked like it had an occupant, as if the place could function on habit alone. The basement door was old, but not beyond use. The stairs led where they were supposed to lead. The space itself felt organized, not cluttered, not improvised, but set for something that knew what it would be used for. The old man's records didn't line up with Andy's memories of a live voice and current presence. No recent prints, no fresh proof of an active human body. And yet the kids had been there, and yet the mask had been seen. And yet the basement had the residue of the promise. Candy wrappers, spilled sweetness, dampness in the air where fear had sat and waited. No mask, no confession, no explanation that fits. The police interviewed the children repeatedly, comparing descriptions until they matched in the one detail nobody could invent consistently out of panic, the paper plate mask. But when the investigation expanded, when they searched for any scrap of the mask, any rubber, any plate, any evidence of production, nothing surfaced that could be held up in court. No perpetrator's mask recovered, no confession, no direct physical clues that could point to one person. No clear witness who saw an abductor leave. No clear vehicle tied to a person with a known name. Nothing that could be converted into a timeline with an ending. It wasn't even just the absence of proof. It was the way proof refused to appear. Investigators found no smoking gun to convert the supernatural feel into something prosecutable. They couldn't explain how a dead man's method could continue. They couldn't explain how the children's memories remained consistent. They couldn't explain why the basement had always been ready. So the case became what it hated being, baffling. Despite the extensive investigation, despite the interviews, despite the rummaging through records and rumors and back alleys and crawl spaces, the police could not identify a perpetrator. And because they couldn't identify a perpetrator, they couldn't end the fear with a sentence or a plea deal. The aftermath. In the weeks that followed, the town tried to heal in the only way it could. Families kept their kids closer. Parents walked routes with flashlight beams before letting children go out. Teen groups formed lines that didn't loosen. Porch lights stayed on even after candy ran out. The old house became a forbidden landmark. The property was fenced off, the windows were boarded, the whole place was cordoned like an illness the town didn't want to catch again. People still drove past at a distance, slowing down without meaning to, looking for signs that the yard had changed, for evidence that the nightmare had moved on. But the yard looked the same. The air on that street stayed heavy around Halloween, as if the season remembered what it had done. And because there was no mask, no arrest, no confession, the town couldn't even be sure what kind of horror it had encountered, human or something else wearing human timing. Cliffhanger. A morning that doesn't belong to the past. The next morning, Andy walked to school alone. The sky was pale and cold, the kind of morning where everything seemed clean enough to start over. His backpack thumped softly against his spine. His breath made small white clouds that drifted away without drama. Ahead, an old gray truck passed him slowly, so slowly it felt deliberate. The engine noise faded as it moved forward. Then the truck stopped ahead of him, rolling to a halt like it had been waiting in place the whole time. Andy looked up, confused. The way kids get confused when adults act strangely but don't present danger yet. The window rolled down. Something was tossed out the side door, lightweight, papery. It hit the shoulder of the road with a soft slap. Andy hurried forward. At the bus stop, beside the curb where kids usually waited with lunch pails and jokes, there lay an old paper plate. It looked damp with morning chill. A rubber band had been stapled across it to shape a crude mask band. The plate folded into the suggestion of a face. Tiny eye holes had been poked through with careful pressure, small, round, and evenly placed. There were no mouth holes at all. Andy stared at it until his stomach tightened. Then the old gray truck's engine roared once, tore forward, and disappeared down the road as if it had never stopped, leaving only the plate and the sudden, sick certainty that whatever happened the night before Halloween wasn't finished. It had only paused,